You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Bill Thomas, and Kristin Dilley is on a well-deserved vacation, which means I'm flying this ship solo, and perhaps almost blind. I don't know. We'll find out. Joining us today is Wendi Reed, retired investigator who's very prominently featured in the new Burden of Proof documentary on HBO, which discusses the Jennifer Pandos case. So, Wendi, welcome to Mind Over Murder.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into the Jennifer Pandos case, Wendi, tell us a little bit about yourself, about where you grew up. You and I were discovering that we're both, I don't know if you like the word brat, but we're both service brats. Tell us a little bit about your life, where you're from, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I grew up in a military family. My dad was in the Coast Guard. So we actually grew up in Yorktown, which is very close to Williamsburg. I lived there for most of my childhood up until almost middle school, moved to Boston. I lived on Cape Cod and then St. Louis and graduated high school and went to college. And then I joined the Air Force. My dad wouldn't let me join the Coast Guard. He said everywhere he went to, he was always put up in Air Force billeting, and we lived on Air Force bases. And he said, they treat their people the best. My intention was to go in for 4 years and use that to go to college. And that's what I did. I lived in Montana, and then I separated, got out, and became a police officer.
So then how many years were you actually in the Air Force? Was it just the 4?
Just the 4. Yeah, I knew. My mom said I always said that I was going to be a police officer when I grew up. And I knew going in, I wanted to do it for 4 years, get the training and the education, and then come back and be a police officer.
Before we get into that, let me jump back to something here. Your dad was assigned to St. Louis. What kind of Coast Guard do we have in St. Louis? I thought that was on the Mississippi River.
Yeah, they actually do a lot on the Mississippi River. Yeah, and he was at the headquarters there. He was a master chief. My whole life, he was a master chief. He was never on a boat when I was alive.
Oh, he wasn't?
Oh, he did spend some time up at Sault Ste. Marie on a boat when he first enlisted. But yeah, during my lifetime, he was always at headquarters buildings.
So he was directing people that were on boats. But when you're the master chief, you're pretty high up. So you're one of the people that's in charge.
Correct, yeah.
Would you go to his office and see what it was like when your father was at work, or were you exposed to that side of things?
Oh, absolutely. When we lived in Boston, their office had like season tickets to the Bruins.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And they would like raffle the tickets off. And when people couldn't go, they would give them to my dad. So I would actually go up with him in the morning and spend the day, and then we'd go to the game that night.
Oh, how fun. Is this at the old Boston Garden, or am I dating myself here?
No, it was the old Garden. Yeah. Yeah, it was awesome.
Of course, my dad was a naval officer, and his final active duty slot was running the Armed Forces Police Department out of the old Boston Navy Yard.
Okay.
And his career was winding down, and he was actually moving towards a career in academia. This was during the time frame of the Boston Bruins. Bobby Orr, that team was red hot. and we moved back to Lowell, Massachusetts, up north of Boston, as we were heading into high school. So the Bruins were a really big deal back then. Every kid in New England had Bobby Orr flying through the air vertically, having just scored yet another goal for the Bruins. And we would watch the Bruins on television. And we got a chance to go to the old Boston Garden several times. And then, of course, later, as I got to be a teenager, that would be the place we'd go to see concerts. I'm sure the new Boston Garden is great, but I still have fond memories of, we would take the train into North Station, and then the arena was upstairs, and you'd go up these long, winding ramps to see the Bruins and the Celtics play there.
Yeah, it was quite the experience, that's for sure.
And then you were saying that it was quite a contrast for you then to go from a relatively small high school on Cape Cod to a big high school in St. Louis.
It was, yeah. I have conversations sometimes with people that they live in the same area their whole entire life, and they don't know anything different. And I really, sometimes I long for that and that sense of home. But at the same time, moving as much as we did, I was exposed to so much diversity in different people and different cultures. And I see it as a blessing now as an adult. I hated it as a kid. Every time you made friends, you moved. But now it's just, I'm so thankful for the experiences that I was able to have.
Yeah, we really liked it. There were 4 kids in my family. And yes, it is hard to say goodbye to your friends, but we looked upon it as an adventure. My dad would come home every 2 years back then, typically towards the end of the school year, and we'd have a family meeting. And then he would tell us where we were going to move.
Yeah.
And this is before the internet. We would then go, typically, we still had a few weeks left in school. And of course, we would go to the library a lot. We'd go and read about the new place we were going. I remember we'd look at pictures and get out the encyclopedia and look at maps. My mom and dad would show us where we were going to be living. It was an adventure. And then the 4 of us as kids, 3 boys and 1 girl, my younger sister, Kathy, we'd pull together and we'd be our own kind of gang. But a lot of times when we were moving, and I'm not sure if this happened as much for you, we would be moving to places where there were lots of other military kids. So they had a sense of the drill. And they also knew that it was important to make friends and to make friends quickly and to be welcoming of the new kids.
Right.
In 1 or 2 places, we moved to towns where there were not a lot of other military kids, and it was really noticeable. We moved to Deptford, New Jersey, because there was no housing available on the Philadelphia Naval Base. So we were across the river in suburban New Jersey. And these kids mostly had all grown up in that town, and they were incredibly unfriendly. They even called my older brother, Richard, Hawaii, because we had lived in Hawaii before then. And they said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Hawaii," which was true. They actually didn't even call him by his name, Richard. They called him Hawaii because they'd never met anybody. Now, here's a guy with red hair and fair skin and blue eyes. It wasn't like he was a native of the Hawaiian Islands.
Right.
The kids were super unfriendly, just not nice. A few months later, housing became available on the Philadelphia Naval Base, and we moved again. And the kids there, who were all Navy and Marine Corps kids, they were like very welcoming. They knew what it was like to be the new kid. That would happen every couple of years in most examples. So now you're the kid, unlike most of us, who knew what she wanted to do.
Yeah,
you wanted to be in law enforcement. How did you get into law enforcement when you got out of the Air Force?
I came back to Virginia, and I ended up applying at a small local sheriff's office. And I actually worked in the jail there for a couple years, and then I taught the DARE program. I had gone to a school and met a guy who worked with James City Police Department, and he just went on and on about how great of a department it was and how I should go over and work for them. And he sent me an application, and I put in, and that was it. That's how I ended up with James City.
So what year is it that you're joining the James City, Virginia Police Department?
It was 2002. when I got hired in July of 2002.
And now help us out for those of us that are not from Virginia, which includes me. Kristin, Dilley, my podcast partner, would laugh. Why do we call this place James City County? It's such an odd little name.
I have no idea. It's a very odd name. Yeah.
But it is a county police department.
Correct.
For James City County, which is not a city but a county.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it pretty much surrounds the city of Williamsburg. Williamsburg is a super small city. And then James City County surrounds Williamsburg. You would think I would know the story of why it is called that, but I do not.
So does Williamsburg, Virginia, have its own police force?
They do. Yeah, the Williamsburg Police Department.
And so James City County is the surrounding areas around Williamsburg.
Correct.
Is there cross-jurisdiction, or would you hand something off to Williamsburg PD if it was within the city limits?
Yeah, if it's within the city, then the Williamsburg Police Department would handle it. Yeah. And I mean, it's a weird area because there's also York County. So you can walk a half a mile and step foot in James City County, Williamsburg, and York County. There's so many places where one side of the road is York County and the other's James City. And there's so much that intertwines.
Yeah.
But yeah, if it happens in the city of Williamsburg, then the Williamsburg Police Department would handle it. Yeah.
The Jennifer Pandos case starts in February 1987 with the disappearance of this 15-year-old girl from the Kings Mill resort/housing development. Tell us about your involvement with the case. So you're at the James City County Police Department. How did you first hear about the Pandos case? And then how did you get involved officially?
Yeah, there was a bulletin board in our police department that important information would be posted on. And one day I saw like a missing persons poster, and it was for Jennifer, and it had her picture on there and that she had disappeared in 87. And I was just like, that's weird. I'd never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. It was just this poster on a wall. And I had been slated to go to the investigations division at that point. So I talked with the major in charge of the investigations division and said, hey, what's the deal with this case? And can I look at it? And he's, yeah, sure. And he said, the case file's missing. So we don't really know a whole lot. And in January of 2006 is when I went to investigations. And it was shortly after that I was officially assigned the case.
Did you ask for the Pandos case as a result of that interest?
I did. Yeah, I asked to work the case.
It's 2006. That case took place originally in 1987. It's probably considered a cold case at this point. I don't know if people use that expression. Did they?
At the time, I don't remember specifically if it was classified as a cold case. We didn't have a cold case division at that point. I know it was being worked on sporadically, but no, there was no cold case division. Later, one was developed and I was assigned to that. But at the time, there was no cold case division, but that was certainly what I would consider a cold case for sure.
Now, what other sorts of cases were you working when you started in investigations in 2006?
I was assigned to basically violent crimes, murders, rape, robbery, things of that sort.
Let's talk about this missing case file. This figures prominently in the Burden of Proof documentary that's just made its debut on HBO. What did people say about the missing case file? First of all, can you give us a rough idea how big would a case file be?
For that case, you would expect probably 30 pieces of paper, 50 pieces of paper in it, depending on what the initial response was from the police department when she went missing. You would definitely expect there to be some substance to that case file.
Would it be in a file folder or a box, or they call those things red wells that are expandable? What would it physically look like?
Just a manila folder. Our records division at that point, unfortunately, was not what I would call secure. Anybody could walk in there.
Ouch.
Yeah, it was before anything was electronic. So all there was the paper copies of a file. The procedure to get a file was supposed to be you would go and request the file, and you would have to sign it out. There was only a clipboard next to the door, and you would get the file and then write your name and the date and what file you have. But in order for that to work, it's dependent on people actually doing what they're supposed to. Unfortunately, with there not being any accountability to that, it went missing. Yeah.
And unlike cop shows that we watch on TV and enjoy, there isn't somebody there at the door, if you will, checking to make sure that people signed the files in and out.
No, absolutely not. There was a desk there for the records clerk, but there was only one of them, and she couldn't be there all the time. So it was basically left up to the integrity of the person to do what they were supposed to do.
And it sounds like, I'm not trying to be too pointed here, it sounds like things were sloppy back then. You said not secure. Were people investigators and others, were they pretty informal about going in, taking a look at a file, bringing it back, but not necessarily doing the whole clipboard thing?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was very lax. It was a small department. At that point, there was less than 100 officers for the entire department. Yeah, and I think everybody was just complacent and, oh, that won't happen, or, oh, I'll put it back when I'm done with it. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And there were lots of theories on what happened to the case file, some pretty outlandish, but yeah, it was definitely a challenge not having that.
What's an outlandish theory about what might have happened to the case file?
One of the avenues that we did explore, we were told that Ron Pandos, Jennifer's father, played golf with the head of security from Kingsmill. Kingsmill, where the Pandoses lived, has its own security division. Now it's a police department, but at that point, I believe it was only security. But we were told that Ron golfed with the head of security there. And it just so happened that his wife, when Jennifer disappeared, was the head of the records division for the James City Police Department. So one of the theories was through Ron's relationship with the head of security, he had his wife take the file to help Ron and Margie. She was the records clerk from then. She was interviewed and denied having any part of that. But yeah, that was one of the theories of what happened to the case file.
Does that seem plausible?
It is plausible. Yeah, it could have happened, but I do not believe that's what happened at all. No.
Although in the television series, I believe it's Cynthia Hill, the director of the film, who was mostly off camera, but someone asks you a question. And in my opinion, having watched plenty of true crime, you appear embarrassed for the department.
Absolutely.
You indicate as such. How did you feel when you found out that the file had magically reappeared?
It's mixed feelings. I still remember exactly where I was when I got the phone call and what I was doing. And I was elated when I got the phone call saying the file had been found. I thought for sure that would open up a lot of things that we didn't know and give us more opportunity for investigation. I was no longer assigned to the case. I had been promoted and was a supervisor in the patrol division at that point. So I wasn't working the case, but I was so excited. And then when that excitement died down, it was like, what in the world happened? That's just crazy.
Was there ever an adequate explanation for where this case file went? How long a period of time was the file in the Pandos case missing, would you say?
Oh, gosh. When I went to investigations in 2006, it was gone. I don't know how long before that it had been gone. And I'd say it was probably 2016 when it was found.
So we're talking about a decade, maybe? The file was, quote unquote, missing?
Yeah.
What were the circumstances of when the file was found, as you understand it?
So we had been in we call it the old police department in 2006. Very small building, no control over who went into records, who didn't. When I was assigned the case and the case file was missing, I had met with the head of the records division at the time. She searched the entire records room. Basically, they were paper boxes full of manila folders with the case files in it. She searched through every single box, every single file cabinet, couldn't find it. A few years later, we had a new police department built and we're moving from the old police department to the new one. During that time, she had told me they went through every single file. She said they opened up the files and actually looked in them to make sure maybe the Pandos case accidentally got stuffed inside and mislabeled. So they went through every file, every box before they moved. And then when they were unpacking the files in the new building, they also went through them again. And there was no sign of the case file. So it had been searched for in the records division 3 times pretty thoroughly. And then in the new department, the records division is accessed with a key card. So there is a little more accountability for it. And by that time, we were mostly electronic. You could access what you needed on the computer instead of having to get the actual hard copy of the file. What I was told was one day someone in the records division went and opened up one of the paper boxes and there it was, just sitting right flat on top. Not as you would think if there's 50 files in a paper box, they're all vertical so you can read the tabs on the files.
Right.
But this was laid across the top. So pretty obvious. There was no investigation as to what happened. There were theories of what happened. My personal opinion is someone was complacent. They went and got the file to actually do something with it and probably stuck it in their desk or their file cabinet. And there was a couple people retiring around that time. There were investigations.
Yeah.
And my opinion is that someone found it in their belongings and lacked the integrity to stand up and say, hey, my bad, I have this, and just stuck it in there knowing that someone would eventually run into it.
Not necessarily malevolent, just perhaps sloppy. And as you said, it was very informal back in the day. Someone went and got a file and they would take it back to their desk and maybe they were working the case actively. I was thinking the same thing. And yeah, you can go with all the Ron Pandos playing golf with the head of security theories you want, but I think most of the time it's some sort of screw up, if you will, where someone accidentally sticks the case file. And as you described it, it wasn't that large. It wasn't like it was a banker's box full of files. It was a manila folder with documents in it, which could have been misplaced.
Yeah, I definitely don't believe it was anything malicious. Like you said, I think it was sloppy, unprofessional, just lax. Yeah, it's so embarrassing. It really is.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Switching gears for a second, one of our takeaways, Kristin and mine, from watching the documentary was that we felt that Ron and Margie Pandos' odd response, I will call it what I believe it to be. And remember, we lived through this with my sister Kathy's murder. I felt like the Pandos' response, as described in the television series and all the articles we read, to Jennifer's disappearance was extremely odd. Do you feel that their response to Jennifer's disappearance made them look like suspects, particularly Ron, the father, from the beginning?
Absolutely. When I say from the beginning, I take that as when I got it. So it's the beginning for me.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what their responses and reactions were when it initially occurred in 1987. But yeah, what I had to go off of was a lot of people's memories from 19 years before, and probably a lot of like the game of telephone. I heard this and I heard that. And yeah, the things I was hearing was definitely suspicious that they responded in the way they did or didn't respond. Yeah, it definitely made it seem suspicious. And I think a lot of times we look at things from our own perspective and our own experiences, and everybody's different and are going to have different reactions to things. And I think sometimes we get stuck in the mindset of that's not what I would have done, so that's weird.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of things that they did, it did seem suspicious and cast a lot of doubt onto what their involvement was.
One of the things that really shocked us was as the series unfolds, and of course this 4-part television series is told roughly in chronological order, and it's amazing to see footage from investigations and interviews all the way back to 2016, if my memory serves. But as the story unfolds, it appears that Margie, Jennifer's mother, actually has additional valuable pieces of evidence in her possession that have never been turned over to law enforcement. For example, if I understood the series correctly, they had the original copy of the note.
Correct.
That was left. So that meant that law enforcement had a photocopy of it?
Yeah, I honestly, I don't remember offhand if there was a photocopy of the note in the original case file that ended up being located. But yeah, she definitely had the original note, yeah.
And then later on, these letters to and from Jennifer, their teenage daughter, are produced, and they are in a box that Margie has been holding on to for more than 30 years. This struck me as profoundly odd, particularly since so much of the discussion of the case and this note that was found at the time of Jennifer's disappearance that switches back and forth between first and third person. So some of it sounds like it's written by Jennifer, some of it sounds like it's written by someone else. Since language and handwriting end up being so pivotal, I was baffled that Margie would be sitting on letters to and from her daughter for over 30 years without ever thinking I should show these to the investigators. How did you feel about that?
Yeah, it was frustrating. Margie was never super forthcoming. She would provide things if they were specifically asked for, but yeah, there was no urgency on her part to be proactive in the investigation. When I originally started talking to her and Stephen, I asked about physical abuse in the home and abuse in the home, and was told, no, there was none. And I can understand not wanting to admit that, but at the same time, in order to effectively work a case, you have to have the truth. So it was frustrating to find out later the extent of the abuse that was happening in the home and find out a lot of things that would have been helpful if I would have had them initially during the investigation.
Did you feel that Stephen was also not forthcoming?
He had said initially there wasn't any abuse in the home. And I think that if you grow up in a certain environment, that becomes your reality. And maybe at the time he didn't consider that to be abuse. I don't know. Or maybe it was just, I fully remember sitting in Margie's living room with her and Stephen, and I asked Stephen, what do you think happened to your sister? And he said, she ran away. And I said, well, why do you think that? And he said, I don't have any reason to believe otherwise. So I think he was in the dark for all of those years. And I wouldn't say that he wasn't forthcoming. I think probably initially he didn't maybe believed that what he had gone through was abuse, because that was just his reality growing up.
One of the fascinating aspects of burden of proof is watching Stephen's view of the case change over the years. He seems much more willing now to admit that his father was incredibly abusive, physically and emotionally, but that may be not where he was as a younger man. At some point, he said something about everything I was led to believe in the first 22 years of this case is wrong. So that's a big revelation to see him go through, and his viewpoint that, first of all, my sister ran away, and then later thinking for years, it would appear, that his father is directly responsible for his sister's disappearance and likely murder, and that his mother is involved in a cover-up or is complicit somehow. And then later, you begin to see that he's come around, as have others, to the view that, wait a minute, those stories are all wrong. She didn't run away. Perhaps Ron Pandos, the father, is not involved in her disappearance and likely homicide, which steers us to other suspects. But watching that journey, and I'm sure there are hundreds of hours of footage of Stephen and you and so many other people all taking this personal and investigative journey, it's one of the most interesting aspects of the show. Do you think it would have made a difference if law enforcement, for example, had the original note?
100%. Absolutely. Yeah.
I worry, though, I agree with you, but I worry, though, that the original note would have been put away accidentally, let's say, in the legendary missing file folder for all of those years. And there were no backups or duplicates of much of this material. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. Yeah. That's definitely a fair statement.
Are situations like that better now, Wendi, than they were back then, in terms of, I wince when I hear about, these documents are missing, and I think to myself, there's no extra copy, there's no electronic copy, there's no nothing?
Yeah, it's definitely better now. I know that, especially with the way that technology has advanced over the last 15 years or so. Now reports are all done on the computer and they're automatically just uploaded, and there's an electronic copy of it. Where when Jennifer disappeared, it was just handwritten, and if something happened to the copy, you're out of luck. So it's definitely, I think, much more of a secure situation now.
So here's a question for you. If you were to start working this case today, where would you start?
If I had all of the information, I would probably start where I started before, with the parents. But there was also information in that case that leads you to other places too, that I didn't have that information when I worked it. Yeah, I would still definitely look at the parents, because there's still been a lot of suspicious things that have happened with the parents, with things that they have said and things that have happened during the investigation. So yeah, I would still start with them, but there were definitely more investigative avenues that would have been approached.
Our investigators in the Colonial Parkway murders have said to me over the years, Bill, no one's really cleared in a homicide investigation, and I don't think Jennifer's walking through the door tomorrow. So I believe this is a homicide. So no one's really cleared until the murder is cleared. That is, we've identified a suspect and brought him or her to trial. As I understand it, people are on the likely list, that is the short list of people who are most likely suspects, and the less likely list. Ron Pandos, Margie Pandos, and others have been mentioned as potential suspects, and it makes perfect sense. Do you feel like the Pandos parents would be on that less likely list at this point?
When you talk to people that know the case, it seems pretty split, that some people, some investigators and some officers believe, yeah, the parents may have something to do with it, and others believe, no, it was the boyfriend. And I think there's evidence that points to all of them. Less likely or more likely, it's hard to say, really. If it were to go to court, say, if the boyfriend was charged, I think it would be super hard to get a conviction because of just the circumstantial evidence against the parents and the doubt that would raise. The same as if Ron were to be charged and go to court, there's evidence and circumstantial evidence against the boyfriend that would lead to doubt. So it's a hard question to answer as far as less likely suspects. I think with the information now, it's just, there's a likelihood that anybody could have done it.
Wow. So you find yourself in a very frustrating place even now in 2023.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's clues pointing to different people, and it's hard to really settle on a belief as to who did it.
It's referenced in this series that you were working on a book on the Jennifer Pandos disappearance. Are you still working on a book?
I am. We've had to start over a couple of times. Initially, what I wanted to do was tell my story of my journey along working this case and what I ended up learning about Jennifer. And then when the documentary came along, they delved into that. And I found that what I revealed during interviews with them, and a lot of that obviously wasn't aired, but I revealed a lot of that during the interviews, and a book would be redundant, I think. So we changed the approach to that to be, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Patricia Cornwell or not.
Yes.
But she wrote a book called All That Remains.
Yeah, which is clearly based on the Colonial Parkway murders.
Exactly. Yeah. And while it is deemed as being fiction, it is very much based on actual events. It has recently turned into that sort of approach. While I wouldn't say it's in its infancy, yeah, I'm still working on it, and it's something that I'd like to get out there eventually. But right now, writing a book is not a priority in my life, I guess, right now. But it is something that I would like out there at some point.
We've discussed All That Remains, and I've never spoken directly to Patricia Cornwell, but it's very clear. I'm considered the greatest expert outside of law enforcement in the Colonial Parkway murders. And it's not a role I sought, but it's just developed. But I remember being shocked when I finally went out and bought a 75-cent used copy of the paperback of All That Remains and read the book. I was floored. It is the Colonial Parkway murders, and in particular, one of the homicides is covered in so much detail. I believe that it is quite possible that Patricia Cornwell had a significant amount of non-public information about that particular murder, which is considered part of the series in the Colonial Parkway murders. I know the case backwards and forwards. When you get into that level of detail, and I think I've read every article, listened to every podcast, watched every interview, and I'm hearing and seeing things that just still aren't part of the public discussion. And I think to myself, that's interesting. If Patricia Cornwell wants to discuss it with me, she's welcome to reach out. I am highly confident that the case as described in All That Remains, she may have switched the order around, and the lesbian couple aren't the first ones killed, and it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's definitely the same case, and the amount of detail is very striking. You might want to jump off then into more of a fictional version of what might have happened in the Pandos disappearance.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. You and I had talked earlier about the fact that Jennifer lived very close to the Colonial Parkway.
Yes.
And that was one of the investigative avenues I took pretty early in the case was, did she find herself on the Parkway and become a victim there? I was allowed through that investigation to see the case files for the Colonial Parkway murders. And yeah, I agree with you 100% that that book is very accurate with a lot of facts that aren't public knowledge.
Or certainly weren't back then. In other words,
exactly.
We've done a ton of press and media. We did a 4-part television series, The Lover's Lane Murders, on Oxygen. And I've been very outspoken, as have other family members, about the details because we're trying to push the FBI and the Virginia State Police. When the book came out, which I think is 1992, a lot of that information wasn't publicly available.
Yeah, and I know that she had reached out to people in law enforcement and talked about the case with them and talked about just different aspects of law enforcement in the area and things like that. How she got the information, who knows? But yeah, it was very striking how accurate some of it was. And really, Jennifer's case is pretty much an open book at this point. In the documentary, Stephen going through all of these papers and things, and he was able to get the case file from when I took over the case. As far as I know, has not been able to FOIA the original case file that was lost. But my understanding is that he does have a copy of it. It's frustrating to some extent from an investigative standpoint that things like that do find their way to people who are not investigating it from a law enforcement standpoint. And why people leak things, you never know what someone's motive is. Unfortunately, sometimes information that you wouldn't want out in the public ends up being there. Jennifer's case is pretty much an open book. I think the only way for me to portray a story in a book form is to make it fiction and take some liberties as to what happened. Because in the end, we have no idea really at this point.
Do you think Jennifer Pandos' disappearance can be solved?
I think it can, absolutely. Whether or not it will is another story. You and I talked earlier about politics in agencies and whether or not this case from 1987 is a priority for the James City County Police Department right now. I can't say. I don't know. I know that there are things that can be done still from an investigative standpoint that aren't being done, haven't been done, and probably won't be.
What would
in a perfect world, you'd have unlimited resources to be able to investigate things. And unfortunately, in the real world, it's not like that.
Wendi, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us. We
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it. We hope you'll consider coming back with us as things develop.
Anytime.
That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. As always, thanks for listening. Kristin Dilley will be back next time, so if you miss her as much as I do, she'll definitely be back when she returns from her beachside vacation. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.